All right. Hey, what's up? Thank you for taking a look at this video. I missed a good day or two there on releasing anything. I am ready to get back into working on this game now. I had run into a design decision issue where I wasn't sure how to keep the scanning system compelling as opposed to just a thing that's in the game. And my idea was, a lot of the ideas I had conflicted with the idea of not having any caps for resource values and stuff like that in the game. All of the ideas I were coming up with would revolve around capping more or less capping infrastructure maximums. So I wound up taking a good day or two to think about it and just kind of really consider what I would want to do for this part of the game, because I actually have a lot of the other parts of the game figured out design-wise, but for scanning I'm finding that the density of things to scan, it's hard to make that infinite because you're asking for infinite diversity at that point. And it starts to get into a lot more logical elements to support that kind of environment. And I'm trying to avoid it. I'm trying to avoid a lot of depth in terms of logical elements for this part of the game, for this stage of the project. This stage of the project is much more about expanding your empire more or less. It's not about a bunch of logical elements. So for now I'm trying to keep it kind of within that framework. And the idea I've got at this point is effectively allow the scanning frequency value to not cap, which allows the player to have a higher frequency strength, which does still help with how fast the scan finds a target. However, this is going to break the little idea I had to use colored waves. So I'm going to wind up, my idea right now is to remove the wave color, or remove the different wave colors of the visible light spectrum, and instead just use like a white wave or like maybe a gray wave or something. And then allow that to be a standard color for every frequency, and then the frequencies will be able to effectively go beyond the imposed limits brought about by the fact that there's a finite number of visible frequencies. And from that, the player will not have a capped resource or scanning frequency value. So that will uncap effectively. It will still help the scanning system because higher frequency scans travel faster. I'll actually be able to yank the scaler for the scan value. Now that the scan value just increases linearly, it can just increase its cost linearly also, or even just multiply radius, like range of scan times the frequency or something. It doesn't have to be powered up like it is at the moment. So there's a couple things to change in that regard. And then from there, what it really comes down to then is a scan resistance value, giving things the ability to resist being scanned. And that's even a potential infrastructure value. So Planet could invest heavily in the ability to deny like long-range scanning data or something like that, or it can disrupt up to certain frequencies in a scan. And there could either be a natural phenomenon where like some kind of signature has a scan resistor through like a natural phenomenon. The only one that really comes to mind is like some kind of particle cloud. And that particle cloud would have resistance to low frequencies or something, and then the player would have to commit to higher frequency scans to actually like bust through that. But that's like a smidge Loracle, so I don't know if it would be something specifically like that, but something like that. The main thing would be other character entities would, or like other empires would be perhaps have a vested interest in scanning resistance. So for now, if the scanning system runs like that, then that provides a reason to keep pushing up your scanning frequency value if it's important to bust through scans like that. I'm also considering a later mechanic where, like the nebula have dense clouds essentially on their outer surface, and then inside's hollow where there's stars. And effectively, scans can't really bust through the nebula barriers at lower frequencies. So to do deep space scans would require high range but high frequency as well to like bust through the nebula clouds, and that kind of encourages the player to expand into their nebula first. And like once they've expanded into their nebula, the nebula usually has natural openings where they don't have to push through the resistance of the barrier of like the boundary cloud. And that creates the ability to have some intricate space designs throughout the galaxy, because the galaxy can be like enmeshed of these nebula, but these nebula actually act as like corridors that interconnect. And it's kind of like you're scanning your way out of the nebulas to a certain extent. And that creates instances where you can have like choke points and stuff like that, because like maybe within interstellar space it's not that far away from another nebula, but like because of the dense barriers of the boundary gas, it could like make it very difficult to get through there. And it would actually be less resistance to like take a longer route that goes through openings and stuff like that. So it just creates a smidge of explorative capacity for the scanning system. The problem sort of remains, what is the player going to find? And it's obvious they find stars. It's obvious they can find planets, which means vis-a-vis find some kinds of moons. Outside of that, though, it's like the only phenomenon I've really come up with is like you got to have some kind of asteroids for materials, some kind of minerals. And the only other thing that really comes to mind would be some kind of gas. Which is like, I know like every other space game has rocks and gas, so I understand that's not very diverse. However, it would fit the game well enough that I could show off. It would essentially allow me to complete mostly the rest of the game. The hard part being rendering things like the nebula clouds, for instance, and then actually rendering a galaxy is like, at least at high definition. At low definition, it's not hard to do necessarily. This very, very particular thing about what the player is scanning without it being lorically driven is definitely got me hung up a little bit. So the only thing I've really considered so far is to, like I said, change up the scanner just a little bit, and then definitely add some signatures with rocks, like asteroid fields, And then within those asteroid fields, there are rare materials. And then maybe try to consider a couple other types of phenomena, like maybe there's a comet or something, and we could figure out a way to like harvest the comet for ice or something. You know, I don't know what, but the thing I would have to do to like add a lot of diversity to that is research some things in space I'm not aware of. And there might be a few things. However, the more specific the phenomena, the less it's like, or like the less efficiently I can create it, basically, due to having to add specific art assets. So like I'm looking for ways to make it more procedural, to get a little bit more prototypity completed. So for now I'm not quite going to figure out how to do that in particular. Instead, I'm going to simplify it a little bit by changing the scanning system a smidge and then just going with a couple signatures just to allow scanning frequency to assist in unlocking those things. And then by having that decided, I can start work on rebuilding the spawn system, because the spawn system will not only have to like spawn nebula and stars and stuff around the stars and stuff around what's around the stars and sub-signatures, but it's going to have to diversify their signature, for lack of a better term, signature radius, which is essentially how small they are. Because the smaller they are, the more frequency they require, essentially. And from that, I can have a system that spawns a new star, a new surrounding nebula, which is another way of saying its place in the galaxy. And then maybe you could like randomize what kind of moons the planet has. Randomize other planets in the solar system. Moons around those planets. There can also be rings around those planets, so maybe those planets could have like ways to scan their rings or something, but that seems like that could just be incorporated into the planet, more or less. Besides for that, then it would be like signatures of certain sizes. And I'm trying to think of a good way to make it where things that are harder to scan give more resource somehow. So if they're harder to scan, they have like either a better resource or very simply it would just have more resource to harvest is the easiest thing. And then like a gas cloud thing of the same variety, some kind of like maybe like frozen gas cloud that's in space, or like I'm trying to think of some kind of gravity thing. I'm not sure. It would just have to be, and I think the player would just get it that there's gas in space. I think they get it. And that's also a resource that they could gather. And the third thing would be a potential to have pirates. And the pirates are essentially like a minor faction that is massively under-economized compared to the player's like starting planet, but it's effectively pirates of the player's origin, more or less. So it's more or less the player's pirates, quote unquote. And then that opens the ability for there to be pirates for other factions also. There also could be just interstellar piracy. And essentially, there's just a chance that there's a signature in the system that is like some kind of hovel that the pirates are using. And from there, the pirates have a small economy, and they have the capacity to more or less create ships to attack the player with. So if the player just ignores the signature, then eventually the pirates will probably create a couple ships, and that'll start screwing up like the mining and stuff like that. And that's kind of what I'm going for. It's just a way to allow the player to discover a combat priority, which kind of pushes them into ships, into spawning combat ships to a certain degree. That way it's not the same thing every time where they are only scanning and only making like scanning ships. It opens up the variety. And it might be just enough, because if those things can just act as some solid support, like support economy values, then the player is essentially given the ability to support their economy. And depending on how I do the compound system, which I'm still trying to figure out for some extra diversity, there's likely going to be a lot of different values that could be spread around the galaxy in terms of minerals and gas and stuff, because each of these types essentially could use its own rare resource to make it stronger, to accelerate its production or whatever. And then essentially what that does is it allows the random spawning system to determine which of those resources is quote-unquote a rare resource or not. And that would change per galaxy generation. Like, maybe one time the player will luck out and get like a huge cache of like most of them or something. But usually it's not going to happen. Usually they're going to have to find as much diversity and claim as much diversity or trade. And it allows me to simply have a flat slate of resources that are not intrinsically rarer than others, since they all have, the only thing that limits, or the only thing that winds up changing their value is actually their scarcity. And essentially what that does is it gives the player some diversity to their builds, because if certain resources pop up and they just happen to be in like some kind of nebula where certain resources pop up, then it's feasible enough that like the player's locality may lean very heavily in favor of like one or two materials, and that's going to give them the ability to invest heavily in those stats. And if they still want to make other amendments, they still have the ability to do that using the base economy system. However, the rare resources accelerate the research. And very possibly the rare resources also are required to like build ships with those bonuses or something like that, perhaps, which almost is a trade-off to using the system in that regard. So I haven't decided on that. There could also be base resources that are used for building ships to some capacity, and those could be put into the game space at a large degree also. The easiest thing would be to just make a mineral gas spawn type with varying signature radius, and then make sure the scanning system can detect, or make sure that the scanning system properly discriminates against things with lower scanning radius, or things with a lower like scanning signature size. Alright, so sorry about that. That was me kind of talking for 20 minutes. The last video was just me talking for like an hour about some of this design stuff. And this video talked about it for like 20 minutes, which that's just what you have to do sometimes when you're like building a video game. You have to design the game. So I apologize that that's part of the process and that's why it's getting recorded, but that's how this works. So alright, so at this point, if I do a scan, it's got these colors, which I'm changing. So we might need to change that. So I've got to try to remember exactly where I changed this color at. Let me take a look at this component, and I remember it was in this switch case. So more or less what's happening is this color is now just going to be hard-coded to a starting color. And I don't have to do this at all. I am going to leave it in there though. Since it was functioning piece of the code. So now the color will simply default. So let me make sure that it doesn't have a default already. I'm going to assume it doesn't, and I'm just going to open up the, I think this is the correct one, active player scan shader graph. And instead of using active scan color for this, I'm simply going to revert it back to an HDR color. And we're using an emittance value since there isn't a global light source. I'm just going to make it white for now. And let's leave the intensity at 0 and see how it looks. I'll see if the shader breaks anywhere else. Alright, so, okay. So that's just a white wave. And if I increase the frequency, I can even try to get it up to 2. It's still a white wave. And I can even change, I can change other values if I need to in the long run. Alright, so another thing I was considering while I've got this open is I don't want to make this system redundant for the player. If they know they have to scan at the beginning every time, that becomes redundant. However, they do basically have to scan every time at the beginning. However, my goal is, depending on what their local space looks like if they have like 3 moons or something, which I don't know if that's how often that will happen, but in some weird event like that, that ties up the player's close range scanning a little differently, and they don't have to invest in scan range as quickly. Whereas if they don't have any moons, then they're going to have to invest in scan range pretty fast. And that also depends on how close certain signatures are to them. And that will effectively add a smidgen of diversity as they start to build up other values and make other decisions on how they're investing. However, I was going to change, what was the other thing I was going to change here? I was going to change this, the way the price is different with the higher scan. So the argument will be that if it costs 1 to go up to scan 2, but the return is like 500 times as much because the signature provides a lot more, or 50 times as much, then I understand where that's coming from with a balance, as a balancing concern. But for now, I'm just going to leave it to where it's, I kind of feel like just multiply the frequency by the range for some reason. Alright, so let's take a look for that. Let's see, the scanning price is basically, I think it is basically right here, isn't it? Because it's whenever the active scan is launched. That might be, I mean, I'm under the impression it would be in here because the button is where the scan is getting fired off. So the economy ticks, the economy depreciates, the displayed economy gets reset, the scan is instantiated. The color now stays the same. Oh, but okay, so the cost of the scan was actually getting decided in the sliders, now that I think about it. Alright, so the cost of the scan is no longer a mathf.power. I'm simply changing this to, I guess, value, new value. And it's just going to multiply by its own value and not by a power variable. And that's in the event the scanning frequency changes. Let's double check if the angle changes. Was I using the power value also? Yes, so I'm going to yank this out here as, whoops. I'm going to yank this out here as well. And then one more time. And from here, it's going to be much more straightforward. Range times frequency times scanning area. There isn't a extracurricular power value involved. Let's make sure it's working relatively properly. So if I click on this and bump the range up, more or less the range price should go to half if I go to 2. I guess it's not exactly true. If I go to 3, it's like, there's already a lot of other modifiers going into that, so. So I think it's obviously enough that higher frequency costs more. And there's still options for rebalancing later if necessary. Alright, so from that then, we effectively have our scanning system set up to function a little differently. Which means more or less we just need we're just going to need the scanning system to be set up properly. So let me see if I jump this frequency up so I can scan quicker here. It's still unlocking mostly everything. Alright, so I'm just going to have to jump into this next part, which is actually a pretty intimidating part of this game, is the spawning, being able to, like, it's not going to be like a literal entire anatomically correct galaxy, obviously. Like, it's not going to have hundreds of thousands of nebula. It's maybe going to have a couple dozen nebula. And it's very much computer hardware specific anyways. But I am going to have to decide, or I am going to have to design a system for randomly spawning the planets. And randomly spawning signatures in the game, basically. So let's start with checking out our spawn celestial body script, because that was our prototypical spawner, but alright, so really quick, I'm going to grab my notepad and define a few things here. So I had a few ideas for how this is going to work. One idea was to have a galactic hub spawner that radially projects into like tens of thousands of positions. And each of those positions is some kind of system spawn, and then start to encapsulate them from the ground up. Or I could take it a step back and just make each of them a system, but it seems like going one or the other is going to be better. So if I did a galaxy spawn, it's going to have to determine a number of nebula, basically, using some kind of random value. There might even be some subcategories it has to determine, like nebula, certain nebula densities or certain nebula like complexities. So maybe how like thick the walls are, what kind of resources they might perturb to. That's pretty straightforward. There's basically just the number of nebula. So then if you're in a nebula spawn, I think it's more or less the same thing. You just have like some number of You basically have a number of stars. Stars slash suns, they're synonymous. And then those, so there's also a random number of those. And then it has to like determine types of suns, basically. And it also has to position them inside the nebula space. So the idea that just came to mind was like essentially plot the volume of 3D space, or plot the nebula's volume with 3D points at a resolution, and then just do like a random some kind of random choice at each point of whether or not it stays as a point or leaves, and then sat that up to like 80 or 90%, and you're left with like maybe a dozen random points or so within the volume of the space, and guaranteed to be a certain distance away from the edges. And you can just randomly pick a bunch of spots for signatures. So I can kind of see how that could work. So then you're looking at the system spawns. And for this, it would effectively work the same way as the volume nebula thing. Although I could keep it all 2D for now. Like the nebula could be represented as a 2D thing, and then each arm of the galaxy could be like 4 or 5 nebula that extend into the arm. And then there's like a couple of arms of nebulas. And then the closer to the middle, like the more the nebulas like smushed together. Or like the idea would be that their gas, like the nebula, like actually encompass the same space more or less. So you could have some star systems that spawn in like a dual nebula or something like that, which could yield pretty dense, like particulate, perhaps. Okay, so the system spawn is going to have to determine, it's going to have to like recursively do a couple things, because the star has to spawn, then it has to choose planets, then the planets have to choose if there's moons. So I guess the easiest thing would be just number of planets. And then per planet, number of moons. And then once the planets are done, number of, I'll just call this signatures for now. And there's some random number of those. But it has to like assign size and type to them as well. So signature could, so it has to have a random position, it has to have a random signature radius, and it has to have a random resource type. So when a signature is decided upon, it's got to fill in its parts. Which means it has to take a position. It has to choose a signature radius, and it has to pick a type, pick a sig type, basically. And then it has to like deactivate its renderer and all that kind of stuff. But besides stuff like that, it's like its position, its radius, its type. So I'm looking at how to do the randomness, and essentially it's kind of what I was just discussing with the Fibonacci thing. There's essentially the sun in the middle as like 0, 0. And then the Fibonacci like goes around on the outside and it keeps expanding equidistantly on the outside. So the idea would be to like expand that out to some value and then simply pick like 1% of those values as points in space, and then feed those points into the positions of our signatures that are randomly generated. Either that, or there was another idea I had where the sun is in the center and you simply pick like a number of radius, so maybe 18, and then what it does is it splits, or it picks 18 different radii basically around the planet, and it uses that as the orbit of the element, and then it picks a random value on that orbit and essentially just plots like 18 objects on rings. So that's another way I considered it, because I don't remember the Fibonacci like value. I have to look it up. The other way though might not be as well distributed. There's a shot to have random values. It just about worked though. And then if that all spawns, then like local space diversity achieved, and then once I plug it up to the nebula spawner and the galaxy spawner, it's galactic scanning playground basically of diversity. Of infinite replayable diversity, more or less. Barring computer hardware. Which will leave some, actually does bring up one other thing then. I think the Unity's maximum, like, the actual maximum size that I have to expand it to is like 10,000 by negative 10,000, so like 20,000 cubic meters, more or less. Which means there's an idea I had to basically make the galaxy rings, or make the galaxy, the idea was basically to make the galaxy arms like the edges of that 10,000, and then more or less the galaxy and the nebulas and the systems and the ships and everything could feasibly all exist within the same space, within the maximal Unity game space. And from there, transitioning scenes effectively becomes a matter of simply zooming in and out on particular spots. And once the zoom passes a certain threshold, more or less all of the objects in the previous tier can just get deactivated. And then whatever elements are necessary for the incoming tier get activated. So even though they're crunching values, they aren't rendered. They may not even be active. There may just be pseudo data being run on them. And then the pseudo data is used to rebuild them in their logical places. Anytime the player starts zooming in and out of nebula and star systems and stuff. So as long as I can make that part efficient, to where it's not actually holding who knows how many objects. As long as it's intelligently rebuilding objects, it should work pretty good. Or it should work. I shouldn't have to use multiple scenes or something like that. Alright, so I don't know if I'm going to start that in this video. I think I might wait to start that in the next video. One thing I am figuring out though is that I'm probably going to need a certain planet prefab. So even though there is a planet prefab already, I'm going to need a couple different planet types. Which is more or less a planet like this. This one is called, for instance, Continental. And that is more or less the standard, human Earth planet. And I'm going to make a new prefab called Continental. And then I am, in fact, okay, so I'm not actually sure if I'm not sure if I can use the same material, or I don't think I can. So I think I'm just going to have to make a new material. So I'm just going to do that. So I'm going to come in here and create a shader graph, HDRP, lit shader graph, and it is going to be, we'll call it Continental lit. Whoops, accidentally called it Continental lit, but I fixed it at the very end. So now we have a continental planet, and for now, I can set its base color, and we'll just make it an earthy green color. So something like this, perhaps. So a 0. Although that won't look great on the darker background, so how about a 0.5 green? I'll make sure the emission is the same. And so now we have a quote-unquote green continental planet, not just a white planet. And I just have to kind of run through this and do it for a few more types of planets. So we're also going to, I guess I can just drop this in, huh? Let me see if I can make another unique prefab or not. So oh, and then I have to make sure that the Continental lit is actually using the Continental lit material. Alright, so now let's go with Continental. Same thing, we're going to drag it in here. Original. And the second type of planet that comes to mind just happens to be... Actually, I'm going to do it the other way. I'm going to delete this, and then I'm going to use a planet as the prefab generator. Make an original prefab. And we'll change this planet's name to lava. And I'm not sure how I'm doing this wrong. Because I swear I just did it like this. Let me see, planet. And then if I change this to lava, maybe now it will not, maybe it won't freak out now. Okay. And then just because I don't know if it will screw something up, I'm just going to generate the shader graph in here. And a lava planet can theoretically emit a lot more light than a normal planet, being red. So, something that I'm not focusing on at this exact moment, though. The artsy-fartsy part of it. And right now I'm just focusing on... And I guess I can just change this thing's name then to... So the next one, that makes sense, is an ocean planet, a gigantic water planet. Oh, and then the lava. Just gotta remember to drop that material on there. The ocean planet. Oh, whoops, I already did have one. The ocean planet is going to use it, also do the same thing. It's going to have its own shader graph. Because eventually there might also need to be a specific type of algorithm for the actual, for actually patterning like an ocean on the surface or something like that. And okay, so it's a deep blue. I kind of like it. Maybe 0.3 isn't so bad for this. That might be, hold on. Okay, so I was at blue, and I could have swore this was just 0. Oh, maybe this was 0.3. 0.3, what was this? Okay, so it was just 0.31. As it's a lighter blue for an ocean planet. And there's still like Fresnel effect around the edges of a planet, so each of the planets will have to basically get like a Fresnel node slapped on them. And then the other thing is each of the planets is going to have to use global illumination to make the sun light them up. So I have to tweak a bunch of things for that. And then I think there's like an exposure thing I can put on the camera to help with that too. So at some point I've got to make that work out. Alright, so the ocean has the proper color. There's also an ice planet. Which is actually correct, a white planet. still for technicality's sake, we will make sure we set everything up correctly. And make sure we drop the correct material on the prefab. And then we will do one more planet. And I suppose the classic one for this would be a desert planet. Not desert planet, a desert planet. And our desert planet is an original prefab. We can delete this. Planet prefab is fine. The planet will need its own shader graph. Whoops. And I spelled it wrong, so I'm going to delete it. And simply recreate it so everything matches properly. So desert lit. And the color for this is like a brown orange-ish. This is raw yellow. I'm really looking more this is super specific, but let's try something like this. 0.9, 0.60. And we will simply run with that as a desert planet. It still looks a little too on the yellow side. Alright, I don't want to mess around with this too much, but that's way off. Going to tweak it just a little bit further. Oh, maybe that should have been down to 0.5. Because like a dry planet is giving me visions of like a brown, like a light brown color, not yellow. No, not a super yellow color. So we can jump on the desert planet and let's see how this looks from this angle. So that makes some sense. Alright, so now I've got a continental, an ocean, an ice, a lava, and a desert planet. Which those are pretty sensical biomes. Alright, so now there's going to obviously need to be some kind of exposed collection of these things. And instead of doing that in the player data, my idea is to put it in here into the active star system spawn celestial bodies, but I'm thinking about shifting the name of this anyway, but it's already all working, so let's jump in here for now, and I need to create a new game object array. And it's just what? Planet prefabs. And I'll have to actually use this later, basically. But I'm probably going to change spawn celestial bodies to like spawn first system or spawn system, I'm not sure. There's probably going to need to be like a function for spawning a system because the nebula have to spawn systems. Or I'm not sure yet, actually. Not entirely sure. However, we can do this easy step here, which is to simply add the planet types to this list. And from here, we can now allow our algorithm to change. Oh, I missed one. Continent, desert, ice, ocean, lava. Alright. So now we're set up to spawn random planet types at random positions and at random sizes once I've devised the algorithm all the way. So thank you for sticking with this video. It was a lot of talking at the beginning and then a lot of thinking for the middle, and I got a little bit done there at the end. So I appreciate it if you watched it this far. I will see you in the next video. Take care.